the European correspondent Nick van der Meulen in Switzerland, and we are chatting tonight to well-known author and photographer Alain de la Plante in Canada. And later in the program, we'll chat to Jaapie van Niekerk, winner of the Tara Rally in Namibia, and then another big one, Christopher Maxwell of the Bloodhound Project. These are the guys that are trying to break the 1,000 miles per hour record, that is 1,610 kilometers, Byron, record. We're going to chat about that a little bit later, and if there's time, we might even talk about a little bit of Formula One. Stay in the crossroads with Radio Tiger. Right, let's see if we've got Switzerland on the line. Nicholas, good evening.
Good evening.
And you have got your guest, and we've already chatted to Alan, who is in... Alan, where are you in Canada?
I live in Vancouver, just on the west coast.
Okay. Right, and it's now 9 minutes past 10 in the morning.
It is that. Good morning.
Good morning. But Nicholas, a very special reason why we're chatting to Alan tonight.
Well, yeah, I mean, from a personal perspective, there's very much a special reason to conduct this interview in more ways than one. There is a very big book launch that's happening this weekend. Actually, it's happening on Sunday, the 1st of December. But there's a whole lot more to it. But from my perspective, the book, it's basically a re-release, if you like, of my all-time racing hero. And to be able to go along, I've been staring at this book ever since I was a little boy, and now to be able to go along and chat to the author is a big thrill for me. So, Alain de la Plante, good evening and welcome to the show.
Good morning. Good to talk to you, Nick.
Yeah. Well, you know, before we actually get to grips with what we're getting up to, what you're getting up to now, and the future. I'm just kind of curious, how did you get into the world of motorsport?
Well, I think probably just like most young men, I had this love affair with the car. I had my first one when I was 15 and I wasn't old enough to drive it. But still, I worked on it and played with it and had lots of laughs and went around with a bunch of friends. And one of them happened to be a good friend to a fellow by the name of John Courts, who lived north of the town that I lived in. And I got to go up and meet John and found out that he raced cars. I mean, at that time I owned an Austin Healey 3000, which was not a slouch by any means. Mm-hmm. And Courts had an Elva Courier and eventually drove Formula One. And we became pretty good friends, still are good friends. And it just... It grew from there. I went to Mosport, I think, in 1967 for the first race that I had ever seen. And then I went to Watkins Glen the next year to see a Formula One race. And I think probably the first time that I was there, I was with about 6 guys, and we got fairly well oiled, and I didn't really pay too much attention. But I certainly did get the feel, apart from a hangover, of what motor racing was all about.
No, I mean, you also developed this love with photography, and we can definitely vouch for the fact that you are no mug behind a camera. How did the passion for the photography come into play with motorsport, and how did you actually become more prominent? Can you say, for want of a better description, in the field of motorsport for your photography?
Well, to be very honest with you, I didn't want to become a photographer at all. I had absolutely no interest in photography. My father is a photographer. My brother's a photographer. My brother is actually my half-brother, and his father was a photographer, so I'm not sure whether my mother was into chemicals or not. But I actually started working in art at a television station, and then I met a man that's they forced a camera in my hands and said, you got to do this, this, and this. A guy by the name of Bill Shorsey out of North Bay. And this guy took the time to answer the questions that I had. And of course, I carried a camera around with me for my job. And then when I went down to Mosport the first time, I certainly wasn't at all in any condition to take any pictures. But I'm basically an entrepreneur at heart. I had been going to a number of events around, and I had seen somebody that had a little dash plaque, and I thought, okay, so let me just see what I can do with this. And I created a dash plaque for the 1969 Canadian Grand Prix, and the guy that gave me the rights to do that was a guy by the name of Harvey Hudis. And Harvey, I don't know whether I've lost you or not. Have I lost you there?
No, we're still online.
My computer went to sleep and it wasn't me. But anyway, he gave me 4 pictures, which he allowed me to blow up to make into posters. And it was bizarre because the dash plaques didn't sell, but the posters went out the door like no tomorrow. So at the same weekend, I started taking a few pictures, and before I realized it, I looked at the pictures that I had, and then I looked at the pictures on the posters, and I thought, holy God, I mean, I'm doing as well as they are. And it just mushroomed from there, and I went to the track again, and I didn't have any press credentials. But what I did is I had this art background, so I hung around with a couple of guys, and they had press credentials. I looked at them, studied them a little bit, and went back into my car, created my own press credentials. Now, nobody should be listening to this because that's not cool. But I did that, put it in a plastic sleeve, and went out trackside for the first time. And it was a bit of an eye-opening experience, but nobody realized that I had fraudulent credentials at that time. But I started to take some pretty serious pictures, which all of a sudden started to get recognized. And it went from there.
Wow. So you actually began what is now can be regarded as Photoshop. So Adobe should actually be paying you for this.
Well, I didn't do Photoshop. I mean, there was no such thing as Photoshop at that time. In fact, the computer didn't exist at all. I think the Commodore 64 had just gone up to the moon. But I was able to duplicate it from memory enough, and then mask it enough that I was able to pass as a real journalist. And it opened up. It didn't open up doors right away, but as soon as I started showing pictures around, most everybody there was doing black and white. Mm-hmm. And I didn't go to black and white. I went straight to color. And I started producing some pretty large images because in about the second year that I was there was a guy that I knew that gave me a camera, which really set me in motion. He gave me a Hasselblad to use. He said, you use this as long as until you can afford to get one of your own. And of course, with the 2 1/4 square being so much bigger than the 35, I immediately was able to start blowing things up 4 by 8 feet. And people were just sort of looking at the little black and white 8 by 10s and then looking at the 4 by 8 foot full color. And it was a pretty easy sell.
Yeah, I can imagine. That's chalk and cheese. So now going through into the world and you're getting more recognized for your photography, you ended up meeting a diminutive French-Canadian by the name of Gilles Villeneuve. And this obviously is it has been, I suppose, the main topic of discussion with you for many, many years. And, it's not going to end anytime soon, so this is my turn now. And I'm going to begin with proceedings and say, how on earth did you meet Gilles?
Well, basically, I had actually watched Gilles just as a member of all the racers and all the drivers for about 1.5 years before we ever had any kind of vocal contact whatsoever. I had watched him with the medical crew in turn 10 at Mosport, and I mean, he was coming through. This is in a Formula 4 days, and he was spectacular to watch. I mean, he had the back end of his old behind hanging out there so far, and it was always, well, how long is it going to be before he gets into the medical facility? And he eventually did, but that was the first time I really saw him. And then gradually, as he got into Formula Atlantic, where I was doing quite a bit of work, you start to get known by different people for the stuff that you can do, and you start with just a simple acknowledgement when you're walking by, and it grows from there, and it did that.
Well. So going and being, well, as you say, it starts off with an acknowledgement and I suppose a few words here and there in pit lane, and but I've seen this happen over the years. I suppose it also happened with Nigel Roebuck and Gilles, and a whole host of other journalists with specific drivers. How does that bond and that form of trust, if you like, go along and form?
Well, I think the real first serious contact that I had with Gilles happened in, I guess it would have been 1974, 75 more likely, when he drove for Ski Rule. He had a Formula Atlantic car, and basically I did not do any photojournalism. I don't work for magazines. I don't work for anybody other than I work for the drivers, and I work for the sponsors and anybody that's willing to pay the amount of money that I want to do the job. Newspapers and magazines, they don't pay anything. They're cheap, and I just don't go there. I just don't want to go in that direction. Not that radio isn't great, but you don't do many pictures on radio. But
no.
When my way that I used to get into various drivers, into their little circle, was I would do a portrait, generally 16 by 20, and I would tell them that I've got one, and if they wanted to see it. Now, I wasn't doing a hard sell, because in most cases the guys bought them anyways, and after a while I didn't even have to go and show them. In fact, with Gilles, I told him that I had a portrait. And I said, if you want to see it, my motorhome was down at the bottom. I was doing a big job for the Bank of Montreal on a whole thing called a project called the First Canadian Gallery of Athletes, where I did portraits of 69 athletes in Canadian, just to be hung just before the Olympic Games in '76, and. On a Saturday night at Mosport, I had my motorhome down in the back paddock, and I'm about ready to get into the kip, and there's a knock at the door, and I thought, God, who the hell is it at this time of the night? I opened up the door, and right there in front of me is Joanne and Gilles, and I was a little bit surprised, but in they came. We shot the breeze and talked about the portraits. I showed him the portrait because I actually had two of them. And he said that he wanted one for his dad, who had, of course, supported him all through his life, not necessarily financially, but otherwise. And he didn't have any money. There was no questions he had any money. So I said, I'll tell you what, you sign this one, I'm going to keep it for myself, and you could have the other one and give it to your dad. So that's where the friendship started. And then not too long later, in 1975, I believe it was, he ran out of money and ended up at the office of a fellow in Montreal an entrepreneur by the name of Gaston Parent. And he needed $5,000 to go to Shubenacadie in Nova Scotia to race. So Gaston was a visionary, and he certainly was a tremendous. He was a tremendous friend to myself. He was my mentor as well as Gilles in the later days. But I know that he asked Gilles, I think you need to have a photographer with you to record whatever is going to happen, and that wasn't the very first time. That was later on during the course of their career. What might have been 6 months later, because Gilles took off. And all of a sudden, everything looked like it was going to go well. So Gilles said, well, I know this guy, and I like his work, and let's see if we can engage him. So I got a call from Gaston Parent, and he said, we want to make sure that everything that Gilles is doing is recorded. So that's basically where it started. And the next year, before he even had the big race in '76, where he trounced, Alan Jones and James Hunt and everybody else at Three Rivers, I sat with him and I said, when, not if, when you get to Formula One, I want to be there. And he just looked at me and he smiled and he had a little grin on his face. He said, you will. And that was all. And we never had a contract. We actually wrote a contract once for a book publisher. I was in the process. I had done my first book, and I went to the same publisher and said, "Look, I think that this kid is really going to do well. We should do a book on him." So we got together with a journalist by the name of Len Coates from the Toronto Star, who has now unfortunately passed away. And Len and I and Gilles sat down and agreed to do a book on Grand Prix racing, which Gilles would be the commentator and Len would write the text. Me just doing the images. Well, it all at the same time the Toronto Star sent Len Coates over to Europe to follow him. So we had lots of inside information. It was really quite spectacular, and it just kept going from there.
Well, it really, really sounds like a fantastic story, and I think at this rate I'm going to have to ask whether we can interview you again to actually even get more stories and anecdotes from you, because I know the show's not going to be long enough. But, just highlighting on a few things, I know that there are a number of fans and friends that have actually asked me to ask specific questions to you, such as... what was the ambiance and your feeling and the feeling within the paddock at Gilles' first Grand Prix win at Canada in 1978?
Well, I don't know whether, since you're in Europe, I don't know whether you've ever been to Monza, but...
Yes, I have.
Well, you know what the Tifosi are like.
Yes.
All right. The same stuff went down in Montreal. It was just, it was an insane time. The whole town was drunk after the whole thing was over. It just got completely out of hand. Well, it didn't get out of hand. Everybody was happy. Everybody just had themselves a great time. And I mean, it was a fairy tale ending to what everybody thought was going to be his last year. I mean, there was no intention of him not continuing, but the lack of production, was starting to... Enzo Ferrari was starting to get a little bit of pressure from definitely the Italian press, which they definitely have a lot of pressure. But that day in '78, it was just a remarkable time to be part of the whole thing.
Yeah, I can well imagine. It's with this. I can only imagine right from the very beginning that as you arrive, there's a sense of anticipation. The first time that you have a Canadian that has a possibility of running at the front of the Canadian Grand Prix at a brand new circuit, and a little bit of luck. Jean-Pierre Jarier ended up retiring from the lead in the later stages of the race, but Gilles was there, and he went out and did everything that anybody could have expected or have wished for.
Well, the old saw is you got to finish first to finish first.
Exactly.
And I mean, he'd qualified well. Jarier was on the pole. Let me just think. Scheckter, Yodi was also on the front row, and Gilles was in third. So I mean, he was there. He wasn't, but it wasn't easy. But I'm certain, he was so excited when he left the hotel in the morning, to go to the track, that he forgot to bring his jacket. So the jacket that everybody sees in any of the images from that podium is actually Gaston Parent's jacket. It was a great big hunting jacket, because I'll tell you, it was about as cold as a witch mountain.
Yeah, I can imagine. I could see that there were a whole lot of heavy jackets being worn when they were spraying the champagne there on the podium.
There certainly was. There certainly was a lot of There was a lot of jackets and a lot of champagne.
Well, going on through the career, Alan, it's. I think we'll probably have to break for music quite soon, but let us just meander on. In the meantime, just reaching to the untimely end of Gilles. I mean, I think it broke many hearts, and it changed the face of Formula One from the driver's perspective as well as the fans' perspective. Were you actually there throughout throughout his career in Europe as well?
Through much of it, yes. Through much of it.
Okay.
I think he had 64 Grand Prix, and I was in way up into the high 40s.
Well. So
Nicholas, sorry if I can come in here. I think that would be fantastic if we can, if Alan is willing, that we can then next week discuss the European side and some of the great stories there. Alan, would you be available?
I think that I can be convinced. You got to twist my arm. Yes, of course.
Nick, are you prepared to twist on?
Well, I will. I just want to go along and ask for a couple of minutes just to punt the ebook that is going to be due for release on the 1st of December on Sunday. Obviously, this is a book that had been written 30 years ago, and there are going to be, well, it being released electronically, Alan, there's going to be a whole lot of extras that are going to be added to it for a fraction of the price.
Well, the first book was actually was a very slim, tiny little book. Not so slim and not so tiny, but 78,000 copies went out the door. But I re-released this book. I wrote it myself the second time because the first time I wasn't particularly happy with what it had to say. It was mostly pictures. This one, we jumped it up to a great big book with a fully interactive CD-ROM, which allowed Jill to tell a lot of stories. Well, it wasn't until about 6 or 7 weeks ago when my wife could, con me into going to see a workshop done by a man by the name of Martin Crosby and a woman by the name of Catherine Lake. And it was about ebooks. And before I knew it, I turned to my wife, I said, you know what? This has got to be the key. And I have 2 novels. I have several other books as well. I've got a book on John Paul II that I'm going to release. But I have 2 novels that were done, and my wife looked at me, she said, oh, you mean Arnie Trout? And I said, well, no, I want to bring Jill back, because the last book that was released in 1995 was $79.95. It was an $80 book. Now, how many people could afford to buy that damn thing? Yet 47,000 of them went out the door. And I thought, now's the time to redo the book, re-edit the book, add any pictures. And I went to a bunch of my old colleagues who would never give me pictures, for the life of me at the time at 95. And all of a sudden, everybody's happy. They're all skeptical about ebooks. But when you see it, I'll tell you, you look at that front page and you just go, my good Lord, if that's what it looks like inside, I want this book. So that $80 book is now $9.95, and it's going to be launched on Sunday on Amazon.com, and it'll have video clips. It's got interviews with Nigel Roebuck and Jackie Stewart and all kinds of stuff.
So you've actually got video clips as well as an ebook as part of your $9.95 package.
Exactly.
Wow. So this it doesn't matter if you actually own the hard copy. You're going to have to go for the ebook anyway.
Well, I think that's the whole intention. I want to force you rich guys to spend more money. I think the ebook is a whole different. It's on a different category. It really is. It's definitely not the same as having a real hardbound in your hand, but there's a lot of stuff in here that didn't ever come to the surface. There are. I basically stayed with the original text. We re-edited it and rewrote it because it's not a literary masterpiece. It's not intended to be some kind of thing that Longfellow would have written, but it's a visual journey into that era, because it starts in Formula One from the late 60s and goes to 1982 of the unfortunate day. But the video clips include, stuff on Clark and Graham Hill and Jochen Rindt and all the kind of stuff, and then all kinds of stuff that Gilles got himself into and out of, and comments that Gilles had about the time, so that you actually hear him talk. And a lot of people have never heard him talk before.
Yeah, I'm one of them.
Well, Nicholas, this sounds like an absolute great idea. So it's Amazon.com. Unfortunately, we will have to break now for music, and we've got some other stuff lined up. Alan, thank you so much, all the way from Vancouver in Canada. We'll be back next week. Nick will twist your arm during the week, and obviously Nick in Switzerland, thank you so much for joining us. We're first going to break for some music, and it's going to be Sonic Flood with God is Great.